Welcome everyone to our conversation about creating a transformational strategic plan with Ecotrust Executive Director, Jeremy Barnacle. I'm Katie Reardon. My pronouns are she and her, and I am very honored and excited to be our moderator for our conversation today. Okay, so let's jump in. I'm going to open us up with a brief introduction of Jeremy for all of our guests and participants. Jeremy Barnacle joined Ecotrust as the executive director in 2016. He has spent more than 2 decades working at the intersection of policy, philanthropy, and social change. Before Ecotrust, Jeremy served 11 years at the global humanitarian organization Mercy Corps in a variety of positions where he helped guide the organization's global strategy and position the Portland-based nonprofit as one of the most respected humanitarian organizations in the world. Prior to Mercy Corps, Jeremy worked for the State Department, for a U.S. congressman, for several consulting firms, and as a Peace Corps volunteer. Welcome, Jeremy.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, I have to ask, I'm going to get into the lay of the land, but what country were you a Peace Corps volunteer in?
I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Hungary. 1995 to 1997, mostly because at the time I didn't really know how to do anything. And I applied to Peace Corps and they were like, well, you speak English, so you can probably teach English. And where they need that right now is Eastern Europe. So I said, okay, wherever. And it was wonderful. I loved it.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I love it. Can't wait to hear more about that over time. So for today, our conversation today, Jeremy, if you can speak to a high-level overview of Ecotrust and its focus, and then what we'll do for our participants is jump right in and discuss the recently published 5-year roadmap for the organization. Participants, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll do our very best to ask and answer them as we go. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll weave them in depending upon how and where our conversation takes us. So, okay, for our guests today, why don't we start with a high-level overview of Ecotrust? Jeremy, what exactly even is Ecotrust?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question. I think the most important thing to keep in mind about Ecotrust is that we believe that you need to solve for the environment and economic opportunity and equity, and that solving for one or even 2 of those probably isn't going to get you the durable solutions that you want. And so from like a just sort of values and ethos and in theory of change, that's the most important idea. In terms of like the nuts and bolts of the organization, 30-year-old organization founded by an iconic conservationist named Spencer Beebe, who's a Portland native. We work from Alaska to Northern California, so based on a bioregion as we define it. Right now headcount's about 60, annual budget's like 10, 11 million. We work, generally speaking, across kind of forestry, food and agriculture, social finance, increasingly in green workforce, and really do it with a ton of different tools. I mean, that's part of what attracted me to the organization in the first place, ranging from pretty traditional nonprofit-y things around like pilot projects and research and things like that, but all the way through a variety of for-profit enterprises in varying stages of maturity and profitability. And that's, I think of particular interest to you all in the BCorp community.
Yeah. So my understanding is that Ecotrust is I'll call it a hybrid organization, meaning both a nonprofit and a for-profit organization. Can you talk a little bit about what the relationship is between profit and nonprofit?
Yeah. So the lawyers always get bent out of shape when we talk about being a hybrid organization because we are a 501c3, right? So we are a nonprofit corporation. However, underneath that, we've got a variety of for-profit enterprises. Pretty broad range. I mean, we have a community development entity, so basically a financial tool to implement new markets tax credit programs, very profitable enterprise. We own some property that we manage as sort of mission-oriented landlords. I think I saw Franklin Jones from Beeline on the call. So Franklin is a really important part of the Red, which is one of those properties. We founded a private equity fund manager. It used to be called Ecotrust Forest Management. It's rebranded just to EFM. which is all about buying and essentially rehabilitating culturally and ecologically significant forest land. And then, I mean, we have investors who, or EFM has investors that expect some sort of payout. So it's it's a true private equity fund. And so those things, I mean, those entities are all under the Ecotrust 501c3 mothership. And from I guess a more kind of programmatic or strategic sense, those entities really serve the purpose, sort of dual purpose. One is that we do use profits from some of those to underwrite the nonprofit activities of Ecotrust, but ultimately it's about mission impact and using kind of market-oriented tools to achieve mission impact. And so, it's actually a really interesting discussion and tension that never really gets resolved, of the balance between how mission oriented does a thing need to be, what in that overall portfolio of activities, like, different things have different degrees of mission alignment or financial return. There's also even the, debate over this assumption that somehow greater mission alignment means lower financial return, which isn't necessarily the case. It's really, really interesting. It's part of what makes Ecotrust so unique.
Oh, already have a million questions. Okay. So then I won't maybe use the word hybrid in case any of the lawyers are on the listening, but from a partner organization of how fluid it sounds like it might be, how does B Corp fit into the organization and planning?
Well, the only B Corp within our family is EFM, and they operate very independently. And so, we don't, as we think about starting new enterprises, I mean, we haven't had anything recently that we said like, oh, this needs to be its own standalone enterprise, let's make it a B Corp, et cetera. But I mean, our most natural kind of business partners are B Corps. I mean, just by virtue of the commitments that you all make when you set those up.
Mm-hmm. So then, knowing that you have some B Corp in there, obviously the entirety of that umbrella is definitely social impact and purpose driven. It would be great to start to talk a little bit about strategic planning and the role and the importance of that to Ecotrust and all of its components underneath that umbrella. I am a total nerd for strategic planning. I've shared that with you. And for those that do or don't know that about me, I love talking about it. And I've seen it done a lot of different ways, both in the nonprofit and for-profit space. And I was struck by the Ecotrust strategic plan that was launched this year. And it's a five-year roadmap. For those of you that have seen it, check it, or haven't seen it, check it out. I'll make sure to get the link out. But it's really interesting because I was struck by the scope and breadth of it. And I'm just going to read to you a statement that was on the website, and I thought it captured it beautifully, that you set out to create a strategic plan for greater economic, social, and environmental impact. And this is our map for the next 5 years. So I'd love to talk a little bit about why strategically plan at all, and what is significant about a 5-year timeline?
Yeah. So on the first question, and this, it's like every enterprise is idiosyncratic, right? So it's like you try to generalize about processes and stuff, but at the end of the day, it's like everybody and every enterprise is unique. And I think in our case, Ecotrust was so heavily aligned around its founder, right? So with Spencer. And he is a legit visionary. And so for many, many years, Spencer was the driver, and he had a vision and he had things that he wanted to get done. And he attracted really smart people who were mission aligned, and wanted to do that with him. And so as he was rotating out and essentially retiring from Ecotrust, the way that I came in as a leader was not as some sort of replacement for this iconic founder, right? But sort of an institution builder, which is a phrase that he would hate, but I think is accurate and is what the organization needed. So from my standpoint, it's like, well, in the absence of that sort of linchpin founder, right? If we're going to grow and thrive and have our best impact, it's going to be important for this next phase of the organization for us to arrive together at a shared vision and set of goals that are grounded in our founding ethos and principles and based on our competencies, but that we create together, that we own together, and that are really looking toward the future. And so for us, I think it was just a really important thing for the organization to sort of take a moment, take a deep breath, work together, talk to our partners, and establish like, what is it that we want to get done together? And we can get into why that has been valuable, as hard as the process was. But yeah, we needed a shared North Star, and we just wanted to lay out, like, here's what we're committed to doing. Here's what matters to us, both to be accountable to ourselves and to be accountable to others.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's actually really telling. And Ari, I see that you've posted, beat me to it, the next question in the chat. So why don't we weave that one in and we can talk a bit about it of, how did Ecotrust arrive at the values, mission, and vision of Ecotrust? I think probably to your point, there's both the legacy piece and then the current melding of where Ecotrust is headed. And to your point in that, let's talk a bit about that, and then talk a little bit about what was involved in what it took to create the strategic plan.
Sure. So we made a decision very early in the process. And when I say we, generally this process was like crazy collaborative, but on this item, I just kind of like, some of the moving parts needed to stop, right? And so at the very beginning, I said, you know what, like, I don't think it makes sense for us in this process to revisit our mission and really our vision and our values. And so that those things were just like not moving parts. With our values, fairly early on in my time at Ecotrust, I've been there now getting on 6 years, we had on paper a set of values, but as I came in and I asked people, like, what do these mean to you? How do we use them? What do they inform the organization? And basically they didn't mean a whole lot to folks. And so way back then, we said, well, okay, like let's revisit our values and let's start there, right? Because if we're not on the same page about what our values are, like, it's going to be hard to do much downstream of that. And again, in the departure of a founder who had really set so much of that, we needed to arrive at that together. So we arrived at the values, I guess now 3-4 years ago. And so didn't need to kind of revisit those as part of the strategic plan. So we had mission, vision, values, all those things were set. And then it was just like, okay, like, what do we want to do moving forward? And I, similarly, it just became clear to me, personally, and discussing it with our leadership team, that we needed to have a strategic plan, that would just be a helpful thing for us to do. And so in terms of process, the first step was, as a leadership team, like, do we really want to do this? Yes. What do we think the basic scope would be? Do we have any sense of the time commitment and the cash commitment that it would take? Do we have any sense of what we would be looking for in in consultants to support the process? Developed an RFP, put the RFP out in the market, got some proposals, talked to some great folks, arrived with some great partners, and I can talk more about them. And then really just set to it. And if you want, I can really go into like the nuts and bolts of what we did. It's rare you hear somebody describe themselves as a strategic planning nerd. So I want to.
Yeah, no, I love, I think
the
audience, it would be great to just understand. To your point, you had mission intact, and I'm just going to read that statement for our audience, and vision. And then I do think it would be helpful to understand, just like, what was the complexity of that? How do you partner in the organization and externally, especially for the scope and breadth of an organization like Ecotrust? So for our audience, the Ecotrust mission is to inspire fresh thinking that creates economic opportunity, social equity, and environmental well-being. And the vision subsequently is an equitable, prosperous, and climate smart future for our region and beyond. All amazing things. And I think for a B Corp audience, we can all probably feel and see ourselves in trying to bring that forth in our own organizations that we partner with. So to your point, what did it look like to start that collaborative process, both internally and externally?
So, even from the earliest stages, even figuring out what the RFP was going to say, involve people from all over the organization, and then you get the RFP out, and then you create a scoring rubric that involves all kinds of input from around the organization. Then you have folks apply, and you figure out who you want to talk to, and then you've got this very mixed group of folks doing those interviews of consultants. Then you choose the consultant comes on, you start to sort of frame out, like, what are the phases of this process, roughly how much time is going to need, what do you, the consultants, need from us in order to do it. We created what we call the strategic plan working group almost immediately. And that, by design, was a diverse group. It was about 10 people, which is not insignificant given we're about 60 folks, but 10 folks of all different sort of places in the organization. So in terms of positional power, a lot of diversity. In terms of like gender and function and race, like a lot of diversity there. That was, we really prioritized that. And, you know, I'll admit, a lot of that sort of that degree of collaboration in the early stages for me was kind of exasperating, honestly, because I sort of looked at it like, well, hey, I'm the leader and we have a leadership team, and can't we just kind of do this? And yet it was awesome. I mean, it was just so, it was so cool to have what became a really functional group from all different parts of the organization, people I wasn't really used to working with, you know, in my normal work, you know, never really dealt with. And we really got to dig in together. And that group's job was to manage the process. I will say, you know, if anyone's actually thinking about doing a planning process like this, one indispensable part of it was that the woman who was my assistant really project managed it internally in a really great way. And that was super important because everybody, you know, as it would be in your companies, like everybody's got a day job too. You know, and so having that process really managed tightly was very helpful. Also, in terms, you know, for a mission-driven organization, it's so important to have that kind of back and forth communication so that the team feels like they're part of it and they understand what's going on and there's nothing happening behind closed doors, like no black box. I think that was really helpful. So yeah, I mean, we had that working group up and at 'em, and we just worked with the consultants and said, okay, first stage is going to be discovery, right? So like, we want to know from our partners and our own team, like, what do we see out there? Like, what's the landscape that we're operating in? So we did that sort of first stage as a landscape analysis. We talked to, I think that it was like 85, 90 folks, which if we had relied on the consultants to do it, would have cost us a fortune, but our team wanted to do them. Right? They're our relationships. And so we had a pretty good protocol, you know, just a set of questions, and then, you know, went out, did all those conversations, had a small group internally, then synthesized the feedback that we got. They produced what is essentially like an insights memo that we presented back to our whole staff and to our board and said, hey, you know, here's what we're hearing. And then work from there to say, okay, well, given our mission, vision, values, given the landscape that we're operating in, given the capabilities that we have, let's start to sort of frame out goals, right? And yeah, I'll maybe pause there just in case this is getting boring, or you want to.
Well, it's great because I think whether you're in an organization, nonprofit or for-profit, a team of 2 or a team of 500, strategic planning is such a challenging, co-creating, collaborative process. It's also one that, frankly, generally results in a lot of excavation of really who are we and what do we want to do, not only for now, but into the future around impact. And you were about to speak to the goals that anchor the plan. And I want to talk a little bit about those because I think that piece of it is fascinating on how you got to that place from a legacy of who Ecotrust has been to who Ecotrust is now morphing into. So I'm going to read the big goals, and I would love for your insight into how did you get there and what was that process? And then we can talk a little bit about how not only those were co-created, but then what comes next. So the 6 big goals that are anchored in the plan are: 1, to be an anti-racist organization, major, right? Huge undertaking. Climate resilience, intergenerational wealth building, stewardship of land and waters, a culture of belonging, and a resilient business model. How do you hold that on a 5-year journey that starts today?
Yeah. You know, in terms of the goals, I guess the way I always envisioned it was that, you know, you're going to have organizationally 4, 6, 7, you know, something kind of in that general range. And, you know, that I think we were kind of in consensus around, you know, somewhere in that range. My sense was that we were going to want to have goals that were both impact related, right? So the goals 2, 3, and 4 that you mentioned, and you'll hear me refer to them by their numbers because that's how we end up doing it internally, are very much impact. It's like, what is the difference that we're making out in the world? And then goals 1, 5, and 6 are really about us as an organization, which, you know, is an input into the impact that we have in the world, but is primarily focused on the way that we operate as an organization. So I always sensed that there would be something around a commitment to racial equity, something around like a resilient business model. I wouldn't have necessarily predicted the one about a culture of belonging, but that was really interesting. And particularly, I don't think your audience would know, but I'm transitioning out of this role at Ecotrust by June next year. And that idea of shared leadership has become, my departure is accelerating that conversation in a really interesting way. And so, yeah, I figured it would always be some combination of operational and impact related goals. And, the three internal ones that I mentioned were the two of them were no brainers. And then the third was kind of a surprise, but a good one. And then on the impact related goals, the goal 4, which is around lands and water stewardship, is one that I think most folks who know Ecotrust would most sort of naturally associate with us. It's the one that looks the most like a traditional conservation organization. And that is absolutely part of the legacy of the organization and the current work. And so we felt like it was really important to affirm that commitment moving forward. It evolves like anything would. And there's more of a racial equity lens over that work than there would have been 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And then with the climate resilience goal, that's not, sort of energetically that different than something that Ecotrust might have done in the past, but the urgency of the climate crisis and the way that communities are feeling climate impacts just makes that even more urgent and explicit. And frankly, like that goal, I actually feel like if you look at what's in there, is where we have a lot of work to do, because so much of it is about being a support, like a supporting organization for frontline communities that are really kind of at the forefront of both climate mitigation and adaptation. So we've got a lot, what I think of as like a fair amount of relationship building to do on that front. And then with the wealth building one, for folks who know Ecotrust pretty well, we'll understand that we've always had a significant component that's about businesses and entrepreneurship and capital. And this is just a little bit more explicit in terms of wealth building and with more of a racial equity lens.
Mm-hmm. So I think AJ in the chat has asked a really great question around, in the process of co-creating the strategic plan, did you experience generative conflict? And how do you that? I would imagine it's pretty.
Yeah, lots.
Tell us
some
the dirt.
Some generative, some probably less generative. Yeah, no, for sure. We were asking people to work together in a way that they'd never worked together, right? Where kind of traditional positional authority that so many of us are used to really just mattered less. And the idea of like the bounds of authority or the importance of expertise, everybody had to check some assumptions, and that was hard. In a lot of different ways. I think, in terms of the evolution of the organization over time, like there's absolutely, a concern among folks who work in our own folks who work in more kind of traditionally conservation-oriented disciplines, saying, well, is there a place for me in this, right? Are we becoming like strictly a social justice organization, and do I belong in that? And, that was good, healthy, important conflict or, ambiguity, let's say, to resolve. And I am happy to say, without sort of being Pollyannish about it, that it really has helped strengthen the organization, because it's not like we had some exodus of people who no longer wanted to be part of it, but rather folks saying like, oh yeah, I see how these things fit together. And I see how, the work that I've done historically is going to be even more impactful with some sort of racial equity lens on it.
Yeah, in my own experience with strategic planning, I've found that when it's done in an isolated small group, kind of, tucked away in the corner, it's very hard to bring in not only the stakeholders of the entirety of your community, but the most important stakeholders and assets, who are your employees. So curious, I think a good question that was asked here is, how did you balance people's contribution to it in the day-to-day plus their day jobs? And did they really see themselves being represented in this collaborative process, and then the outcome, which is this 5-year roadmap?
Yeah, so the first question, which is a little bit more, I think, nuts and bolts, but relevant, is like, do you make space for people to participate in this thing? That was a huge question, because the way that our business model works, people are basically, a lot of our team are billing times to different grants or contracts or businesses or whatever. And so it's not like most people just have tons of flexible time to say like, oh yeah, I'd love to be part of this. Like, hey, great. And we really want to make sure that people had who wanted to be involved, like could be involved as much as possible. And so there were a million different touch points. And I would say that generally speaking, people felt represented because there were cases. It's sort of like the tension proves the rule a little bit in that, there are cases where somewhere down the line in the process, you'd have a group of folks who worked on a certain thing or whatever, who said, actually, I don't see myself represented there. I'm nervous that we're missing this part or that part or whatever. And we were able to kind of correct for that. And so, yeah, I actually feel pretty good about the degree to which we included people. I just had a board retreat and they were saying, well, we've had this big hiring surge, and the board was saying, well, do all these new people, like, do they, how do they feel about the plan? Like, are they going to want to implement a plan that they weren't part of creating? And my feeling, having been part of a lot of these hiring teams, is that the plan was actually a recruitment tool, right? So it was people looking at that and saying, no, I want to be part of that. Like, I'm choosing to be part of that, not showing up and saying, well, I wasn't part of this, I don't want to do it. So it's pretty powerful that way.
That's really interesting. I just have to pause on that for a second. That is really an interesting, I think, conversation for profits and nonprofits alike, of how to position your strategic plan as a recruitment tool. Because ultimately, as an employee or a potential employee, I'm looking at the landscape of the organization to see, do they align with my purpose, my values, my vision? Do I fit in there? What's the culture like? And to your point, sounds like the strategic plan is sort of the step into this. And if you see yourself in that and the space of where we're going, then it could be a good match. That's a really interesting idea.
Yep. Yeah, no, for sure. And sorry, I don't know, did I fully answer your question?
You did, yeah. And I think what we'll do is keep pulling on that thread a bit, because one of the things that occurred to me too, and what you're saying is, and it's come up in some of our questions around being collaborative, is that this plan, and with you being the outgoing ED, and who knows what the next phase of leadership will look like for Ecotrust, you had to build a plan to be agnostic of a leader. So talk a little bit about that and the importance of that for Ecotrust.
Yeah, I mean, I just think the way that I operate as a leader, and I generally speaking, have not been known for humility, but I've learned some, I'd say, in this job, and so I entered this and just said, look, like, I have a responsibility to the organization to manage a process that gets us to a place that we feel great about, right? But within that, like, I am one of a number of people with, ideas and passions and things that I want to get done. And yeah, I mean, obviously, like, by virtue of my positional power, probably had more influence over how this thing turned out, than most people did. But really, really both worked hard myself to make space. And I mean, the culture is such, and our systems are such, that there were plenty of times, I mean, many times, that I got talked out of stuff, or, in a sense, overruled. And yeah, I mean, as a result, like, a strategic plan is actually a way to grow beyond a personality. I think that's actually pretty dangerous. And so, yeah, I don't, part of the reason that I made the decision to transition out is, as I look at the plan, I don't think that I am the personality to move it forward. I actually think that there are folks of different profile, different skills that would be more impactful in it. So yeah, I didn't find that part that hard.
Well, I think it's an interesting nuance, because as a person who has built many a strategic plan, sometimes you can get a little, I'll own it, territorial over the work, or you want to see it manifested in X way. You want the outcomes to look like Y. And the reality of it is, they take on, when done collaboratively and collectively, they take on an ebb and flow of their own. And I'd love to transition, and I see Rainbow asking a bit of this question too in the chat, around really, what does the data look like, metrics of success? And that could be about a specific goal around racial justice, or any of the other 5 goals of the 6 that you have in there. And I'm just curious, so you've built a plan, now how do you execute and measure it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have a small but very capable M&E team, so monitoring, measurement, evaluation. And they're working with all of us now. I mean, the way that we've organized for implementation is that you've got kind of like a goal lead for each of those goals. And then, a team of folks for whom it's pretty much their day job to help implement those goals. And so, yeah, we just go through pretty much all the, goals, objectives, strategies, and with the M&E team put metrics and timelines to it. Ultimately it's about us being accountable to ourselves and to our board and to our partners. And so we do, it's like we want to have those things concrete. There are some things, when the dust finally settled and we had essentially ratified this plan and we got into implementation, we were like, okay, well, some of these things are actually more just like statements of principle, right? Mm-hmm. And so there is sort of a process of looking through that stuff and saying, okay, what really is actually like a measurable thing, and what would be a meaningful metric of progress or lack of on that. So we're in that process now. And I don't remember if we actually put it in the plan, but for sure we'll do public reporting on how we're doing against that plan.
Yeah. So then does Ecotrust, for folks that know, and again, that umbrella, which is a mixture of for-profit and nonprofit, is there a social impact report where you plan to capture that data? Like, how would you recommend shaping, because having those big 6 goals, and some of them relatively new for the organization, how do you expect to not only bring employees along, but also the community?
Yeah. So I assume that we would do it as part of our annual report. I mean, just in terms of like a annual flagship publication of like, hey, here's what we said we want to get done. Here's how we did. But then with the community engagement, I mean, there are a million different ways that we do that every day, right? On very specific things. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just particularly to the folks that we talk to at the front end of this process, we'll have a pretty active dialogue back and forth, saying, hey, I mean, we've been doing it now. It's like, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's where we landed. Here's what we're going to prioritize. And, as you all know, as mission-minded folks, it's like when you engage community and you're really humble and open to hearing, like you're going to hear some hard stuff and you got to be ready to hear it and respond, which we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as leaders in our region, I mean, I think, one of the things that landed for me when I read the strategic plan is also there's probably going to be a lot of calibration along the way, right? I mean, it's one thing to build a strategic plan, again, whether you're a team of 2 or a team of 1,000, that you can see still being alive in its every moment or in its every structural formation 5 years from now, right? There's going to be an iterative process along the way. Can you talk a little bit about what you think for Ecotrust that's going to look like? So yes, you're tracking measurements. Yes, you're speaking to it on an annual level, but say, 18 months from now, I know you won't be the ED, but you foresee a challenge coming. How do you think Ecotrust is going to own kind of digging back in and saying, did we get this right? Do we need to do it differently for the future?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that plan is going to evolve. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And so from like a kind of a nuts and bolts standpoint, the way that we're thinking of it is that, we need to do an annual plan and budget anyway, right? And so that becomes the sort of planning unit, let's say, for how we implement. And yeah, I mean, as we get into it, there'll be things that we realize were harder than we thought or easier than we thought, or maybe weren't quite right, and we'll adapt. That part I'm not worried about. It's like, we think of it as really like a framework, as opposed to, I don't know, like a piece of legislation that needs to get fully implemented or something like that. Yeah. And even the framework is incredibly helpful. I mean, like we're into our annual planning process now, and the fact that we can do that and say like, okay, like make your plans according to this shared framework, which you just never had before, as it's just a total game changer. I mean, it makes us a lot more effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like you have a baseline or a home base to be able to build from. And I always think about strategic planning as that, right? It's not only the foundation that you're establishing now and into the future, but it's also a calibration tool. Are we still on point? Do we know what our direction is? Do our values still align? Where are we making our investments? Are we hiring the right folks to be able to bring this to life, et cetera? So I always find that in the strategic planning, and again, openly a nerd about it, I love learning how different organizations approach it, because what I learned from the Ecotrust version was it was highly collaborative. It was changing the scope of the organization. It was recognizing both a legacy and a future, and that the organization wasn't necessarily set up yet to do that and really had some big groundwork to do. And then how to make it challenge not only existing norms, but bring in, new, I'll call, dare I say, solutions, but strategies to bring new solutions to life. And I'm just really, I've really enjoyed seeing the process and learning from you and understanding just how expansive it was, and then where the final product landed, and then how the organization is going to bring it to life over the next 5 years, which is great. So thank you again, Jeremy. Really appreciated your time today and your willingness to share that with us. For our audience, if I didn't get to your question, my apologies. Hopefully we spoke to it. Take a look at the strategic plan from Ecotrust. There's some really interesting nuances there. I know that it was both an internal exercise as well as one where they connected with consultants and the like. And I think you can see what those external teams look like through the website itself as well. So if you need any great references in the community, there's some opportunities there. So thanks for everybody for joining. Talk to you soon. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.